If you grew up in a family where love had conditions, where silence felt safer than truth, and where your happiness somehow made others uncomfortable, this message is for you. Narcissistic families don't just break your spirit, they train you to doubt your own joy. But today, we're going to take that power back, piece by piece. Happiness becomes a threat in narcissistic families because it represents something they cannot control, your inner freedom. When you begin to feel good, to smile for no reason, to express lightness or peace, it challenges the unspoken rules of the narcissistic system. In such families, emotional balance revolves around one person's ego. Everyone else learns to orbit around their moods, their needs, their approval. So when you start to feel genuinely happy, independent of their validation, it disrupts that control. It says, I can feel good without you. And that is intolerable to someone who feeds on power and emotional dominance. The moment you show happiness, they may react with subtle criticism, a sigh, an eye roll, a dismissive comment that instantly drains your energy. They might say things like, don't get too excited, or you always think you're better than everyone else. These comments are not random. They are psychological cues to remind you of your place in the emotional hierarchy. The narcissistic family operates on unspoken contracts. You are allowed to feel joy only if it benefits the narcissist. If your happiness shines brighter than theirs, it becomes a threat that must be dimmed. Over time, this conditioning teaches you to associate joy with danger. You begin to hold back laughter, hide your excitement, or downplay your success. You might even feel anxious when good things happen, because deep down you expect punishment. This is emotional training, not love, and it's one of the most painful legacies of growing up. In a narcissistic family, you learn to fear your own light. But here's the truth. Your happiness has never been the problem. Their discomfort with your happiness was never about you. Narcissistic individuals feel threatened by genuine joy because it exposes their emptiness. Your authenticity mirrors what they've buried under layers of control and pretense. Your happiness says it's possible to be free, while they are trapped in a constant performance of superiority and insecurity. So instead of celebrating your joy, they sabotage it to maintain dominance. Healing begins when you start to notice this pattern without blaming yourself. When you catch those old voices saying, don't be too happy, pause and ask, whose voice is that really? Then gently remind yourself that your joy doesn't take anything away from anyone. Your happiness is not arrogance, it's not rebellion, it's a declaration of self-worth. Choosing to be happy despite their disapproval is an act of courage. It's saying, I deserve to feel good even if you don't understand it. It's learning to celebrate your wins without apologizing, to rest without guilt, to love without permission. Each time you honor your happiness, you reclaim a part of yourself that was once silenced. And slowly you realize you don't need their acceptance to shine. The more you protect your joy, the less power they have over you. Your happiness becomes not just survival, but liberation. Guilt is one of the most powerful tools narcissistic families use to keep you emotionally dependent. It's subtle, quiet, and often disguised as love or concern. You begin to feel responsible for other people's moods, comfort, and happiness. When you were a child, you probably learned very quickly that being joyful or independent could upset someone important, maybe a parent, sibling, or caregiver. If you laughed too loud, wanted something for yourself, or expressed excitement, they might withdraw affection or make you feel ashamed for it. Over time, your nervous system learned a dangerous equation. Your joy equals their disapproval. This emotional manipulation creates a pattern of guilt that follows you into adulthood. You start feeling guilty for resting, for setting boundaries, for saying no, or even for feeling happy when others aren't. Narcissistic families install this belief early, that your role is to make others comfortable, not to be yourself. Every time you do something that feels good, you hear that internalized voice whisper, who do you think you are? And because you were trained to seek approval, you begin to shrink yourself just to avoid that sting of guilt. What makes guilt such an effective control mechanism is that it doesn't require constant confrontation. Once the narcissist conditions you to feel responsible for their emotions, they no longer need to tell you what to do. You start doing it automatically. You become hyper-aware of their moods, anticipating reactions, and adjusting your behavior to keep the peace. This emotional caretaking is mistaken for love, but it's actually servitude. It keeps you locked in a cycle of self-sacrifice while convincing you that you're being good. But here's what they never want you to realize. Guilt is a boundary disguised as morality. It tells you where you've been manipulated to believe you owe something. Gee, you don't. True love doesn't demand emotional repayment. It doesn't ask you to dim your joy to soothe someone else's pain. When someone weaponizes guilt, what they're really saying is, your freedom threatens my control. And that realization, though painful, is the beginning of your liberation. Healing from guilt requires unlearning the belief that your happiness is selfish. You begin by asking, who benefits when I feel guilty for being happy? The answer will always point to control, not love. Start small. Let yourself rest without explaining why. Celebrate a win without apologizing for it. When guilt arises, don't fight it. Observe it. That discomfort you feel is the weight of conditioning, not conscience. It's the echo of years spent trying to earn approval that should have been unconditional. Every time you choose joy over guilt, you rewrite your emotional DNA. You begin to realize that your peace doesn't harm anyone. It simply reveals who cannot stand to see you free. True healing isn't about silencing guilt completely. It's about recognizing it for what it is, a leftover voice from a story that no longer belongs to you. Your happiness was never the problem. The real issue was that your light reminded them how much they'd lost touch with their own. Gaslighting is one of the most insidious tactics used in narcissistic families because it doesn't just distort your perception of reality, it steals your ability to trust yourself. It begins quietly, often with small contradictions that seem harmless. You remember something clearly, but they insist it never happened. You express how you feel, and they tell you you're overreacting. Each time the message is subtle but consistent. You can't trust your own mind. Over time, that message becomes a belief. You stop questioning them and start questioning yourself. In a narcissistic family, truth isn't about what's real. It's about what keeps the narcissist in control. They rewrite reality to fit their narrative, ensuring they're always right and you're always wrong. If you bring up something painful they did, they'll deny it or shift the blame. That never happened, or you're imagining things. They may even enlist others in the family to back up their version of events, leaving you feeling isolated and confused. This is not just lying, it's psychological warfare. The goal is to make you dependent on their version of truth so that your own perspective becomes invalid. As this pattern continues, something dangerous happens inside you. You begin to internalize their voice. You hear them even when they're not around. You start second-guessing everything. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I did misunderstand. Maybe it is my fault. That self-doubt becomes automatic, and you start to mistrust your feelings, memories, and instincts. This erosion of self-trust is exactly what the narcissistic family wants, because a person who doesn't trust themselves is easy to control. The damage of gaslighting runs deep. It disconnects you from your intuition, that quiet inner compass that tells you what feels right and what doesn't. Without it, you're left in emotional chaos, constant, like seeking reassurance or clarity from the very people who are causing the confusion. You begin to live in survival mode, scanning for clues about what's real, trying to keep the peace, trying not to upset anyone. But peace built on denial isn't peace, it's paralysis. Healing from gaslighting starts with reclaiming your truth. It begins when you say to yourself, I know what I felt, I know what I saw. You don't need anyone else to confirm it. Your experience is valid simply because you lived it. The narcissist may continue to twist words or rewrite history, but you no longer need their agreement to believe yourself. Journaling can help rebuild that inner trust. Write down what happens, how it feels, what you notice. Over time, your written truth becomes a map back to yourself. The greatest act of healing is believing your own voice again. When you say, this happened and it hurt, you reclaim the authority over your own story. You stop letting others define your reality, and in doing so, you reclaim your power, the power to see clearly, to feel deeply, and to trust that your truth has always been enough. In a narcissistic family, your growth is not seen as something to be proud of, it's seen as betrayal. When you begin to change, to evolve, or to rise above old patterns, it threatens the fragile balance of power that the narcissistic system depends on. These families survive by keeping everyone in fixed emotional roles: the caretaker, the scapegoat, the golden child, the lost one. As long as you stay in your role, you are predictable and manageable. But the moment you start to grow, to set boundaries, or to find your own voice, you disrupt the story they've built about you. And in narcissistic dynamics, truth is far less important than control. When you start healing, you're no longer emotionally available to play the same part. You stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. You stop reacting the way they expect. You start saying things like no, or that doesn't work for me, or I deserve better. These simple statements may seem small, but to a narcissistic family, they are acts of rebellion. Your growth exposes what they've worked so hard to hide, their own stagnation, insecurity, and fear of self-awareness. Instead of cheering you on, they'll try to pull you back down. They may mock your self-improvement, question your choices, or accuse you of thinking you're too good for the family. They might say you've changed, as if it's an insult, when in truth, change is the most natural and necessary part of healing. They will often reframe your progress as selfishness or arrogance because acknowledging your growth would require them to confront their own lack of it. This dynamic can be incredibly painful because you want their support. You want them to see your heart, your effort, your intentions. But narcissistic families are not built on mutual understanding. They're built on maintaining a hierarchy. If your growth threatens their sense of superiority, they'll do whatever it takes to regain control through criticism, guilt, or emotional withdrawal. This is why healing from narcissistic abuse often involves grieving the family you wished you had. But here's the truth. Your growth is not an attack. It's an awakening. You are not trying to be better than them. You're trying to be free. You're choosing honesty over illusion, authenticity over approval. And while that journey can be lonely at first, it leads to genuine peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's validation. Eventually, you realize that your growth doesn't need their permission. You stop waiting for them to applaud and start recognizing your own milestones. The moment you stop shrinking to make others comfortable, you begin to attract people who celebrate your evolution instead of fearing it. Growth is not betrayal, it's alignment with your truest self. And in the end, the most powerful thing you can ever do in response to a narcissistic family is to keep growing, no matter how much it unsettles them. Your transformation is your freedom. Shame is the silent weapon of every narcissistic family. It's not always screamed or shouted, as often it's whispered in tone, in looks, in silence. It seeps into your mind slowly, teaching you to see yourself as less than, unworthy, or wrong for simply existing as you are. From childhood, you are conditioned to feel that something about you is broken, that your feelings are too much, your needs are inconvenient, and your voice is dangerous. This is not love. It's control disguised as concern. Shame becomes the emotional leash that keeps you obedient, apologetic, and afraid to take up space. Narcissistic families use shame to maintain hierarchy. The narcissist must always be superior, flawless, and admired, so everyone else must carry the emotional burden of being not enough. If you succeed, they downplay it or mock it. If you fail, they magnify it. If you show vulnerability, they use it against you later. Over time, you start living in a constant state of self-surveillance, editing your thoughts and emotions to avoid humiliation. You begin to think, if I can just be perfect, maybe I'll finally be accepted. But perfection never earns you love in a narcissistic family. It only earns you temporary safety. The worst part of shame is that it makes you your own captor. Long after you leave that environment, the voice of the narcissist lives inside you. You start to shame yourself the way they did, for needing rest, for crying, for wanting too much, for not doing enough. That voice becomes automatic, a background soundtrack whispering that you are undeserving of happiness. And because shame thrives in silence, it grows stronger every time you hide. But healing begins the moment you start to notice that voice and question its authority. You ask, who told me I had to be perfect to be loved? Who decided my feelings were too much? These questions are not rebellion, and they are reclamation. You begin to see that shame was never yours. It was handed to you by people who couldn't handle their own insecurity. They projected their pain onto you because they couldn't bear to face it within themselves. To heal from shame, you must bring it into the light. You speak your story. You share your truth. You surround yourself with people who see you without judgment. People who say, you're allowed to be human here. Little by little, you replace self-criticism with self-compassion. You begin to forgive yourself for surviving in the only way you knew how. And eventually you realize something powerful. The antidote to shame is authenticity. Every time you choose to show up as your real self, imperfect, emotional, alive, shame loses its power. You no longer carry their projections. You no longer apologize for existing. The same traits they once shamed you for, your sensitivity, your empathy, your strength, become the very tools of your healing. In choosing to stand in your truth, you turn their weapon into your wisdom. Reconnection is the ultimate rebellion against a narcissistic family because their power depends on your disconnection from your truth, your needs, your emotions, and your sense of self. When you grow up in an environment where love is conditional, you learn to survive by fragmenting. You disconnect from the parts of yourself that were judged, shamed, or dismissed. You hide your vulnerability, silence your intuition, and numb your emotions, believing that staying small keeps you safe. This emotional exile becomes your normal. You learn to function without truly feeling alive. The narcissistic system thrives on this separation. As long as you are disconnected from yourself, you are easier to manipulate. You second-guess your intuition, seek approval before making choices, and measure your worth by how others respond to you. Every time you try to reconnect, by setting boundaries, expressing emotions, or saying what you really think, they punish you with guilt, silence, or ridicule. They want you to stay lost, because a disconnected person is predictable, compliant, and dependent. Reconnection begins quietly. It's not dramatic or loud. It starts with small acts of self-honesty. You begin to listen to that faint inner voice that says, something isn't right. You stop gaslighting yourself and start trusting your feelings, even when others deny them. At first, this feels uncomfortable, even dangerous, because the old conditioning tells you that being true to yourself will cost you love. But with each small act of self-trust, you reclaim a part of your power that was stolen. As you reconnect with yourself, you start to notice how much energy you've spent managing other people's emotions instead of your own. You begin to see that it's not your job to fix anyone, to prove anything, or to earn worthiness. You realize that the love you've been chasing outside of your LF must first come from within. And when you finally start giving yourself the acceptance you were denied, the grip of the narcissistic family begins to weaken. Reconnection is also an act of forgiveness, not the kind that excuses abuse, but the kind that releases you from carrying their pain. You stop trying to change people who choose not to grow. You stop begging for validation from those incapable of giving it. You forgive yourself for all the years you believed their lies about you. Each moment of compassion toward yourself dissolves another layer of the shame and confusion they built. Eventually, reconnection brings you home. Not to them, but to yourself. You rediscover joy without guilt, boundaries without fear, and love without conditions. You start to feel whole again, no longer fragmented or uncertain. That's when the true rebellion happens, not in anger, but in peace. Because the greatest revenge against a narcissistic family is not confrontation or explanation. It's living freely, authentically, and joyfully. Reconnection is your revolution. It's you saying, I am no longer lost in your story. I am finally living mine.